Hi everybody, Tom Waters here, and I have my latest completed painting behind me. I'm labeling it Sap Run. It's inspired by the sugar maple season here in Vermont, which is just ending. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the process of painting this painting. It's a large painting. As you can see, it's 30 by 40. It took a long time, several hours to complete. I did it in multiple sessions. I'm not the fastest painter. So in going through this, I'm going to put a lot of this into time-lapse, and then I'm going to do narration on top of that. There might be some places where I slow it down to real time just to illustrate something. And the objective here is really just, I've learned so much from watching other artists like Brandon Schaefer and others on YouTube sharing their process of painting, that I thought if there's any benefit to somebody to watch this and see how I did something specific or in general, or even just my thought process behind how I approach a painting like this and the steps I go through and the problems that I encounter, which I do encounter problems along the way, and then how I overcome those. If you take anything away from it that helps you with your painting, then that's my objective and my goal. So I hope you'll join me, and if you like this, I hope that you'll subscribe to my channel and hit the like button down below, and let's get going. Thanks. One thing I'll point out before I actually start and put this into time-lapse here is to just talk a little bit about the process I go through in preparing and thinking about doing a painting like this. I probably spent several weeks thinking about what I wanted to paint and how I wanted to paint it, and in that process I was thinking about the composition. Once I got to the point where I was ready to actually start the painting, I go through a process where I do a whole bunch of thumbnail sketches, and mostly the thumbnails they're a combination of trying to look at the values, but also looking at the overall composition as a series of shapes. So if you strip out all the detail out of this painting and look at how it might, just look in a couple of tones and see if the shapes are appealing. So I'll do several of these, and I do them on post-it notes, and I'll put them up, and then I'll sort of narrow down. So for this, I narrowed down. I don't know how well you'll be able to see this, but I narrowed down to just 2 thumbnails. And look again, I'm looking at the shapes and seeing how they fit and whether they're pleasing and how the eye moves around. And then from there, I sort of take those final sketches and I do a more detailed sketch that is sort of my overall roadmap. So this is how I go about composing the painting before I ever put paint on the canvas. And then the other thing I do is I do use reference photos. But I use reference photos mostly just to get certain aspects of the painting. So for this one, the week before I started this, I actually went up to a friend's sugar bush and took a bunch of photos. And what I took is a lot of photos of the buckets hanging on the trees. I want to get a feel for how they looked. And so I will use those photos to sort of guide me to get the overall aesthetic of how these buckets are going to hang on the trees. Okay, here I apologize. It'll probably be some flicker, because whenever you take video of monitor, it introduces some flicker because of the frame rate. But this is just an example of some of the photos that I took up at a friend's sugar bush the week before doing my painting in order to get reference photos to sort of refer to when I went to paint the buckets and get a feel for how they're going to look and how the shadows fall, that type of thing. Okay, you'll notice that I'm using a colored ground. In this case, I've chosen to use yellow ochre as my colored ground, so I've just painted the entire canvas in yellow ochre. I don't always use a colored ground, although for my large paintings I do. And the choice of color usually is dictated by what I'm painting. And in this case, while it might seem logical that I might use something that's a little bit more neutral, maybe a little bit more gray because it's going to sit underneath a lot of snow and shadow, I really wanted this overall effect of this painting to be warm and bright. And so I chose the yellow ochre because I knew that in places it was going to influence the paint on top of it, and some places peek through, and it would work really well against the blue of the shadows and the snow. So that's why I chose this. So here you can see what I'm doing is I'm basically sketching out on the canvas. I'm using some burnt umber to get placement of everything that's going to be on my painting. And that way it gives me a quick sense of whether or not compositionally it's going to work. I can place in all the pieces of the painting and step back and take a look and decide if I need to make any adjustments. So that's what I'm doing here. As far as my color palette, I use titanium white, yellow ochre, I use Payne's gray, cobalt blue, cadmium orange, mostly mixed with white for the highlights on the trees and the snow, but mostly to create my grays. And then there's a little bit of cadmium red that I use in some purples, but other than that, that's pretty much my palette. So here I'm putting in the sky. You're actually going to see me do the sky twice. I put the sky in once here, and I do it with clouds, and it isn't really the direction that I wanted to start. I'm not even sure why I did the sky this way initially, but I knew right away that I didn't like it. So you're going to see me put this in, but then you're going to see me go back and do the sky over again. Here I am just blocking it in. This painting, I'm painting this large, well, actually it doesn't have to do with the size, but painting like this, I'm working from back to front. So I'm starting with my background, my skies, and then I'll work on the mountains, and then I'll move forward. And that's mostly because I know that I'm going to have a lot of trees and detail that sits on top of the background. And so I sort of want to have that background set as I put stuff on top of it, so that if I have to go back and make corrections, it's not as hard to do, or you know, it isn't really complicated in having to redo some of these elements to get them the way that I want. Okay, so here you can see I roughed in the mountain, and I'm putting in my sky a second time. Now what I'm doing here for the second time, in a minute I'm going to slow this down. So here I am in real time. I blocked in the color. I used a darker blue. I felt like when I first put the sky in, the value was way too light, and it was going to influence the rest of the painting, and I wasn't going to have enough value range. And so I went back and made it darker to begin with, but I also decided that I wanted to use this technique here that you can see, where I'm just sort of dabbing the paint on in little strokes. And what it's doing is it's creating broken color in the background in the sky, so that near the horizon it's a little bit lighter, and then it gets a little bit darker as you go up. But I keep going back to my palette, and I add a little bit of red to the blue to get a little bit of purple. And I'm just dabbing that on and moving that around, so that when the finished painting, when you see it, what you'll find is that the sky has more energy, because instead of being just sort of a gradient, a smooth gradient, it has these little broken color elements that sort of vibrate and give it a little bit more atmospheric effect. And I really like the way this sky came out. I'm not sure how well it comes out on the video, but you can sort of see here some of that purple is getting worked in, more of it down lower towards the mountain, to sort of soften that edge a little bit. And then as I pull out, you can see how the sky works out. So here it sort of jumps. I've put in this middle hill, if you will. This is sort of like a really steep hill that we're facing, that's in front of the mountain. And I really like the way this came out. I've been watching this for the last few weeks here in the winter in Vermont. And you know what'll happen is, on a really steep hill, the trees are really, they grow more sparsely because it's steep, but also they don't overlap as much. And then when you get near the top, because you're near the top, not only can they grow thicker, but when you look at them, there's more trees behind each tree, so it looks a lot thicker. So when you get these little ridges and stuff that come down these hills, you'll have these sections where the trees get thicker, and you create that color band that you can see there. And here what I'm doing is I'm just starting to place in some of those trees that are now going to overlap. They're closer in, and here we go. There we go. And the treetops, you know, extend up over the hill and in front of the mountain and a little bit into the sky. And this is so that as I work my way forward again, those elements will already be there, and then I can just layer on top. Then once I've got the hill in, I'm going down and working my way into just basically blocking in the foreground, getting this sort of the tonal gray and blue-gray that's going to underlie my snow. You're going to see me go back and add layers on this snow again and again and again. So the snow actually is built up over time in multiple layers. You also see me here, I'm painting the edges, because this is a gallery wrap canvas, so I want the edges painted so I don't have to frame this. But here I'm just, you know, my Payne's gray, I love Payne's gray. It's a nice bluish gray color, and so it gives me a nice base for the snow here that I can then add my lights over. And I use the palette knife here also to sort of spread some of that lighter color around and just get sort of a feel of motion and flow
But again, I'll be going over a lot of this now. So again, I'm not worried too much about detail at this point. I really just want to get the canvas mostly covered so that I can get my values. One thing I didn't mention, oh, here I am, I'm starting to introduce the shadows that come from the trees behind. The sun's coming from the upper right-hand quadrant of this painting, and so it's casting these long shadows. What I didn't mention earlier is you might have seen that when I first put in my sketch and my drawing, I didn't really establish my lightest lights, but I did establish my darks at the base of the trees, and so that sort of gives me a reference point.
I'm taking a break from my latest painting here to point out a couple of things that I think I need to address before I continue. They're compositional. I like pretty much what I've done here for the sky, the mountain in the background, for this further away hill. The biggest problem I have is I've got this field that sort of ends here, and then I've got this steep hill that's set back quite a ways, and in between I don't really have much middle ground. I think I need to address that. So, because really, in reality, what's happening is this hill is gradually falling away, but it's forested back here. And then there's this middle hill back here, and then this faraway mountain. So I need to work some more of the forest in here. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I'm not sure how it shows on the camera, but I realized that in putting in these trees, they're all leaning out as they go up. This one's along the edge, that's fine, but this one's leaning out, these are leaning out, this one's leaning out slightly, not a lot, but a little bit. Yeah, pretty close to vertical. So I'm going to address that. I don't think it's a big problem. It looks fairly good. But I know in my reference photos that a lot of these, in looking at my reference photos, a lot of these maple trees, these sugar maples, will sometimes come up in pairs. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to pair a second trunk that comes up here and leans in this way. And that's just going to offset a little bit of the fact that these are leaning out a little bit that way. So that's next. I'm going to tackle this middle forested ground here, and then I'm going to work on the foreground, and in that process, I'll take care of this. All right, let's get to it.
Okay, one thing I should mention here as I'm putting in this sort of tree line in the middle ground, so there's going to be some jumps in this video because when I get painting, I sort of lose track of the fact that the camera's running. And usually I have music going, so I often don't hear the camera turn off when either my card runs out of space or my battery runs low. So I apologize for that, but there's going to be some sections here. I think it's pieced together well enough that you can get a feel for everything that I'm doing. I slowed it down to real time here because I want to point out something that you can just barely see, but above that orange block, which is going to be the sugar house, I don't have any video of this. This is part of what got missed, but you can start to sort of see above there. There's some mist coming up. I started putting in the steam that comes out of the sugar house as you boil the sap. And the way I did that is I used the 1-inch flat brush, and I took some titanium white, and I took some glazing liquid, golden glazing liquid, diluted with some water to get it nice and loose, and I get a nice loose mixture, and then I mostly wipe my brush off, and then I use the corner and I just sort of swirl that around above where I want the mist to be in circular shapes. And I go back probably 3 or 4 times. I start with sort of a gray using some titanium white and Payne's gray, and then I go back in 2 or 3 more times after that as the painting progresses, and just put in layers to create that sort of steamy effect. You can see it here just by the roof of the shack that isn't even finished. It doesn't even have the holes where the steam comes out. But I think in that shot you can sort of see where I've started to introduce where that steam's going to be coming out of the top of that shack. And here I'm just putting in some tree details. Adding a little bit of color in here now. It's a little bit too gray, so I wanted to warm that up and get those intermediate trees with a little bit more color. Okay, so here now I'm going back and starting to work on the foreground snow a little bit more, and you can see I've sort of adjusted where the cast shadows are going. I didn't like the angle that we were at, and so I'm going back and adjusting that, putting the shadow in front of the sugar shack there. and starting to establish more of the, get more of the range that's going to be in the final painting for the snow. And again, you're going to see I'm going to put this in, put a lot of snow in here, and sort of rough it in, because I'm going to keep going back over this at various times. Basically, the snow ends up being a lot of layers, almost like a lot of light colored washes, to sort of give it some depth and keep it free flowing. And here's where my path is going to be with the person collecting the sap, heading to the sugar shack. He's coming through. This is sort of like, the main focal point is at the bottom of the painting with the sap bucket on the closest tree, and then draws your attention first, and then your eye just naturally goes along this path where the footprints are that bring you up to the sugar shack. And so what I'm doing is establishing those and then putting in some darks, and then of course where the snow is displaced, you have those highlights, those white highlights. Okay, so now here I'm starting to block in the trees, and mostly this first pass is just about getting some values in there. And I tend not to work from dark to light on my trees. So I'm working from the sort of the middle value first to underline my trees, and then I put my darks on top of that, and my highlights, of course, on top of that. So right now what I'm just doing is just sort of establishing the shape of those trees in sort of a middle value gray. You'll see in a minute when I do that closer tree, it'll be a little bit darker, because obviously the tree closest to us will be darker and have more contrast. And there it is. So again, you're going to see, and I'll have some detail of where I then add. So I add texture and color to these trees. So right now what I'm concerned about is just getting a base of values and color that I can then scumble on top of to get some texture and get the trees, to the under what I just painted there will just come through. And here, obviously, I'm starting to work on the shadows. Now there's my darkest, one of my darkest darks right there is at the base of this tree. The base of the trees and the shadow on the back side of the buckets against the tree where there's shadow, that'll be my darkest dark. And it'll be very, very bluish purple. So here I am just getting that initial start and cleaning up some of the snow around that tree. You can see that I've already, covered over where there's going to be a bucket hanging there on the right-hand side of that tree. And I've mostly obliterated it, but I know where it goes. Here I slowed this down so I can give you a sense of how I establish the texture on the trees. And what I've done, so I have that underlying color. Here I have a 1-inch brush, I believe, and I'm taking some darker color, and it's sort of a dry brush technique, and I'm just sort of rubbing in and dabbing in some shadow. It'd be the shadow that sits in the texture of the bark. So the overall value of the tree is what I put in before, and now I'm basically adding bark shadow texture to give that tree a little bit more depth. And I'm bringing that because you can see where the sun is, this is mostly in shadow. The sun's only going to hit the edge of that. So this one is getting pretty well covered in some of that darker color. And I'm trying to establish some shading so that I get some, make it feel rounded. Now this is the lower left-hand corner tree, and I've zoomed in here to give you a little bit of a taste. You can see I've got a smaller brush here, and I've got the darks already in on the back side of that tree. And what I want to do is suggest that light coming and hitting that tree and wrapping around before it goes into shadow. So I'm using this lighter color to sort of do the opposite. Instead of putting in the shadows from the bark, I'm putting in sort of the where the light is hitting the top edge of that bark as it wraps around the tree. And then I'm going to show you some detail here too. Again, you can see that's where the bucket is going to go, where that orange is, and that's going to cast a shadow around the tree. So I'm now taking my, a color that's a mix of yellow ochre, there's a little bit of orange in it, and some titanium white, and it probably has a little bit touch of Payne's gray just to sort of gray it out a little bit. But I'm basically dabbing on to create some texture for the bark and to show the effects of the light as it hits that tree and wraps around into shadow. And now I'm obviously working on my buckets. The buckets really are the first focal point of this painting, and you know, it's I like the way they came out, but let me, what I'm doing here is I'm sort of just blocking in for color and value again. I'm trying to establish the shape of the bucket, not necessarily what it's going to look like in the end. And so I'm sort of laying down, my shadow side. Here I'm putting in some darks, and I'm going to pull that. I'm mostly using the 1-inch brush here, though, to establish the shape. I want the back side of this bucket to be dark, and then they have these little tents that go over. Now these buckets, it's funny because they're not smooth. It's almost like a hammered metal. I think they're made out of tin. So in a minute here, what you're going to see, and I'm going to slow down so you can see the detail, is once I've established the values for the bucket, and here I'm doing the snow around it to refine the shape. But I go back in and I use a very small brush. So there I've started here, and it's going to slow down to real time. So now I'm down to real time. And what I'm doing is I'm going in with different values of gray. And here's sort of my mid-tone gray. This is sort of the edge where the bucket turns from light into shadow. And I'm just going in and putting in little dabs because this, like I said, the buckets have sort of a hammered metal finish, and so it's not smooth. And what's cool about it is when you see these buckets, there's little variations in the color. Because it's almost like the texture of a golf ball. It's not that pronounced, but it has that little bit of variation. So I take this little brush here, it's a soft brush, and what I just do is I just keep going back and I just change up the color a little bit, get a little lighter, get a little darker, add a little bit of blue, add a little bit of titanium white, and I sort of create this texture by mixing up these little dabs and getting them lighter as I go to the light side of the bucket, and then going darker. You'll see I get very dark as I go around the back side. And overall, I was really pleased with the way it came out in the end. And in a minute, this is going to speed up again so that we can get through this video without putting all of you to sleep. I really appreciate it if you've made it this far, and I'm hoping that there's something in here that people can learn from, whether it be the mistakes that I make and how I overcome them, or something like this, creating a sort of a different feel for the texture of this element here, the bucket. I'd love it if you subscribe to my channel and or like this video. It'll encourage me to do more of these types of videos. I don't really feel like I'm good enough yet to call these lessons, but there might be something that you learn from them. And the more I do, probably the better I'll get. I apologize, I get a lot of shadows. I'm still working on how to light these videos so that they come out well. And sometimes if I put the camera where the light's best, then I end up getting a lot of shots at the back of my head. So I keep playing around. I'll keep playing around with trying to get better at taking these videos. Here you can see the foreground one is sort of blurry now, but you can see now I'm starting with the darks, and I'm working on the bucket that's on the far side of this tree, and just sort of again getting that texture. Now I'm going to do this. This is the bucket that's on the right side of the painting. Again, it's on the far side of the tree, and there's another one that's just peeking around the edge. So there you can see I get a nice dark that's sort of close to my darkest dark, where that bucket meets the tree in the shadow. So I'm establishing that, and then getting my texture on the bucket, and then the outside edge where the light hits it. Okay, so here I am doing a little bit of detail now, adding highlights to the edge of the tree. You can see here I've started my little man there who's carrying sap over to the sugar house for boiling. One thing you're not going to see here is this is the initial attempt, and when I got done I realized that he was far too small in perspective, so I actually make him bigger. He's bigger in the final painting. Not by much, but by a little bit. You can see here that you see the shack over to the right. If he was to walk down to that shack, he'd come up about halfway, so that doesn't work out too well. You might have also noticed in there that initially I put his shadow in and the angle was wrong, so I put that in over again. Alright, so here I am again. So what happened here is after I got the man and I realized that tree, the furthest away tree, was starting to look like just a gigantic redwood or something. It was just far too big, far too wide. So that was a big mistake on my part, and so what I had to do is I had to go back in and thin that tree out. So I went all the way up. You saw initially there. I put in, I took the mountain color and I thinned the tree out at the top, and then I took that background color and I thinned it all the way down to the bottom. I took out, the whole side of the tree that had that second bucket, and then now I'm going in and just making that bucket a little bit proportionally better sized. So now this looks better to me. I want my biggest tree in the front, and I want them to get thinner as they go back, and that works. Then I noticed that the second huge mistake I had is that front tree that has the big branch coming off it. Those branches were going behind the other trees, and so I had to fix that, bring those in front. And now we're getting down pretty much to the end, and putting in some details, adding some branches coming up around the trees. I do it to the other ones, but I just have this one on the video. And then, along with the branches in a minute here, you'll see then I put in some grass down there at the bottom, just peeking through, and then add the shadows cast off there. You can see at one point I added the shadows from the buckets as well down in the lower portion. And there we are. Here's the finished painting. It came out really well. I'm pretty happy with it. And you can definitely see it at my website, CreativeWatersArt.com. I also have a Facebook page. You go to Facebook and look for Creative Waters Art. And I just, again, would like to thank you for watching. I hope to do more of these, and I'll be encouraged to do that if you like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thanks.